everybody, and welcome. We're really excited to do this panel discussion on the Hagia Sophia, and we're really excited to have you all join us with our lovely panel. And I'm going to begin, Katherine Kelaidis, our own lovely resident scholar at the National Hellenic Museum, is going to kick us off with some remarks of her own, and then we'll roll right along. So thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you enjoy. Katie, whenever you're ready.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Cairo. First, I want to thank the members of our panel who agreed to join us here today, as with many things in our world, on fairly short notice. I'm going to keep my remarks short because I've already had the opportunity to share my thoughts on this topic, as well as a brief history of the Hagia Sophia in a previous video that I imagine Cairo will link in the description because she is very kind. So what I'm going to do is offer some brief framing of why I think this conversation concerning the Hagia Sophia matters to people who aren't Greek or Turkish, Orthodox Christian, or Muslim. I have had the very unnerving experience over the past weeks of watching two deeply connected conversations go on in front of me with the interlocutors of each seemingly ignorant of each other. It is not an uncommon experience for those of us from multicultural backgrounds, but I do believe the uncommonness of our time requires me to comment on it. The renewed conversation around racial inequality that has occurred in the wake of the murder of George Floyd has happened on my social media and in my life in parallel with a conversation, and frankly in my circles, with outrage with regard to the reconversion of the Hagia Sophia into a mosque. From my vantage point, these conversations have a number of points of intersection and much to learn from each other with regard to questions that are not only important from an academic perspective, but from a deeply practical one. These are questions about historical and intergenerational trauma, colonialism and its aftermath, and the ways we imagine and narrate history. I'm fearful that the very particular kinds of discourses seized upon in both conversations, discourses which superficially seem quite different, but are in both instances deeply rooted in early modern ideas about race, ethnicity, and nationhood, are in danger of completely derailing critical conversations about equality, justice, and personal and collective ethics in what the New York University philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah has called a world of strangers. That is a multicultural, multi-ethnic, religiously plural world in which we are increasingly pushed in closer contact with one another. Today, our panelists will be discussing the history and meaning of the Hagia Sophia, including meaning imbued upon it in Islamic and Turkish contexts. These are interpretations that I imagine are new to many members of our audience and potentially quite challenging. They are challenging to me as an Orthodox Christian and particularly as a member of the Greek diaspora. By the way, before you make any of your comments, while I think I'm the only ethnic Greek on the panel today, every member of the panel is Orthodox. So think about that before the comments. This is a product of history, our discomfort, not the panel. Because of the administrative structures of the Ottoman Empire, it is essentially impossible to separate modern Greek identity as it evolves after the 1453 capture of Constantinople from Orthodox identity and vice versa. Modern Greeks as a distinct ethnicity were largely created and defined both within and outside the Ottoman Empire by their Orthodox faith. Likewise, the Church of the Greeks was a common way of referring to all of Eastern Christianity, both in Western Europe and in the Ottoman Empire. Additionally, and a bit ironically, in a connected set of events, the flight of Byzantine scholars to Western Europe, particularly Italy and France, following the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, helped trigger the Renaissance, but also began the idealization of pre-Christian antique Greece as the founder of Western civilization. What I would consider a sort of psychic colonization of Greek antiquity. This created two competing narratives of Greekness in the early modern period. Thus, when the Greek state sought its independence from the Ottoman Empire in the early 19th century, the Greek revolutionary fighters largely saw their mission as an effort to reclaim the lost Byzantine Empire. However, the Western Philhellenes, whose support was crucial in the Greek Revolution, by the way, who were primarily American, English, and French, were instead coming to fight for the rebirth of classical Greece, what I call the Lord Byron problem. This difference in objective is epitomized by where the two allied sides envisioned the future capital. The Greek fighters largely intended to fight on to Istanbul, to reclaim the lost city of Constantinople. The foreign fighters, however, wanted to make Athens the capital, an effort in which they were successful, even though by 1821, Athens was no longer the glorious city of Socrates and Pericles, but a modern backwater. Meanwhile, as Greeks clung to their Byzantine past in Asia Minor, the modern Turkish state, after the 1920s, has worked to erase the Hellenic and Christian past from the region, sometimes violently through population displacement and genocide. This history renders Greece essentially a post-colonial society, or even a colonized one, if we're being specific to Asia Minor. And it is easy to see the parallels between the position of the Greeks in Asia Minor and Palestinians in the West Bank, or even American Indians. I have failed to have anyone explain to me the material difference between the Black Hills and the Hagia Sophia, for instance. But because of our different positions in these debates, particularly as members of the Greek diaspora, I would argue, we fail to see these similarities. So I'm asking you today to listen to these different interpretations of events with an open mind, understanding that who we are will forever shape our view of history. But if we intend to live together, which we must, partially because I imagine the colonization of alien planets will inevitably trigger a jurisdictional dispute among the Orthodox, then we must be able to listen to the perspectives of others. Not to be persuaded by them necessarily, but at least to better understand how we will make enough peace for justice to be realized. Before I turn it over to our very eminent panelists, I want to end on a personal note. A postcard image of the Hagia Sophia, taken shortly after it was converted to a museum in the 1930s, was a permanent fixture on my Yaya and Papu's refrigerator. Next to grocery lists, icon-decorated prayer cards, and school awards brought as tribute by excited grandchildren. The desire to reclaim the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople was not a joke, as Frederica Matthews Green, an Orthodox American writer and a convert to the faith, I think importantly, recently implied on social media. It was a longing born of a wound in people whose parents and grandparents had known real oppression. Like so many Greeks and I think Orthodox Christians writ large, I'm pained in a way I did not anticipate by recent events. I'm pained, in part, I understand, because I grew up in a family and a community that was proud of the Hellenic legacy. Part of that legacy is a spirit of open and free inquiry, a spirit that listens to the ideas, arguments, and histories of other people. That is what I am hoping for today, and I think is the desire of our larger museum community. So I want to thank the panelists again and turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie, for taking the opening remarks. Very appreciated. And with that, we're going to turn over to our first panelist. Phil Dorroll holds a PhD in religion from Emory University in Atlanta. He is Associate Professor of Religion at Wofford College in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and is an Orthodox Christian. His work focuses on Sunni Islamic theology in classical Arabic and modern Turkish, and the history of interactions between Orthodox Christianity and Islam. And whenever you're ready, you have the floor.
Great, thank you very much. First of all, thanks again for inviting me. I'm really happy and honored to be here. Just to start off, I'll let y'all know what standpoint I'm coming at this from, and that is two academic disciplinary standpoints. The first is Islamic studies. The second is Turkish studies, as a study of modern Turkey and its history and culture. So I'll come at those angles in my brief remarks here. And as Dr. Kelaidis pointed out, the context that we're speaking in, and I'm not going to repeat the eloquent remarks she already made, is but I want to emphasize it again, a context of trauma, a context that we're talking about an issue that symbolizes the mass violence and genocide and oppression of minorities in a majoritarian society. So those are the acknowledgements I want to make from the beginning here. So within the context of Islamic studies, or the study of Islam as a religious tradition, I'm going to share my screen with you all real quick. Am I doing this correctly?
Yes, you are.
Excellent. Let me start the slide here to make things easy. So what I'm going to say from my perspective of Islamic studies here, my contribution from that discipline is to elaborate what I think we are actually not talking about when it comes to discussing Hagia Sophia. And what I think we are not talking about is Islam as a religion itself. What I mean by that is I want to narrow the role that Islam as a faith plays in the political events of the reconversion of Hagia Sophia to a mosque and to the history of modern Turkey in general. So that means I need to tell you briefly what I mean by the faith of Islam in the first place. In very general terms, we're talking about a religion that is a monotheistic faith that emerges in the 7th century in what's contemporary Arabia, or then Arabian Peninsula, brought to the Prophet Muhammad with the revelation of the Quran, what Muslims believe to be the revelation of God. The basic components of this faith go something along these next few bullet points. And again, I'm making this point to distinguish what I interpret here are important points to distinguish from one another. The basics of belief are the very simple fact, the assertion that there is one God to whom all human beings owe worship, praise, and service, precisely because that one God is the all-loving and the all-compassionate and merciful to all humanity. The basic point here is that God loves humanity and that we should return that sentiment, that worship and praise, and reflect that divine attribute in our actions and attitude towards other people. Speaking from a theological perspective, the attribute of God here, who is frequently referred to in the Quran as compassionate and merciful, comes from the Arabic term rahma, which is roughly synonymous with the kind of love that Christians, Orthodox Christians as well, of course, mean by the term agape, a particular divine, loving care for humanity that is in Arabic and in Turkish and in other languages like Greek, distinct from human erotic social affection, for instance. There's all different words for this. The word that God has used, the way that God reacts to humanity, echoes this as the compassionate, the merciful. So again, there is one God who has this attribute of compassion, mercy, and love, and that we are to emulate it in our dealings with each other. Worship is crucial here: prayer, fasting, regular almsgiving, and forms of pilgrimage. Why do I say all this? Because the ethical structure here is also very important. To just know that these are verses from the Quranic text. These translations come from the study Quran. The ethics here we're talking about are, again, general monotheistic ethics that other believers from the, quote, Abrahamic tradition would recognize. Why is this important? This is what is considered in the Muslim tradition in the past and today as the core of what Islam is. The parts of it that are subject to consensus, that all Muslims, whatever their denomination, if you will, subscribe to as being unchangeable and central to the faith. And they're described that way in various theological and philosophical discourses. The part that is considered broadly changeable, meaning it varies based on human context, are things like social practice and politics. So my broader point here is that this is what we're talking about with the actions of the Turkish government with respect to Hagia Sophia. We're not talking about actions that originate from the essence of Islam as a faith. We're talking about a particular interpretation of politics that refers to Islam, but is not the same thing as Islam per se. So I just think that's an important distinction to make, that this particular conflict is not a Christianity versus Islam conflict. It's a conflict over different kinds of politics and what those politics mean for the citizens and residents of the contemporary Turkish Republic. So the second half of my remarks will be on Turkish studies. And so what I take to be, let me end my screen sharing. So what I take to be an important element to bring to this conversation from the discipline of Turkish studies. So the second thing I want to say is, okay, if this is about politics and not about faith difference per se, what kind of politics are we talking about? in answering this question, I took a close look at the Turkish text of the Friday sermon delivered at the first congregational Muslim prayer conducted in Hagia Sophia just this past Friday, after the reconversion to status of a mosque. And that sermon was authored and delivered by the head of the Turkish Ministry of Religious Affairs, the highest religious official in the territory of the Turkish Republic. He's essentially a government minister, like all religious functionaries are in the country, and an academic and theologian himself, Dr. Ali Erbash. In that sermon, he outlines the entire reason for the action of the Turkish government. So what I'm saying here sort of comes from my analysis of that sermon. And the basic point I want to make here is, from the perspective of the study of modern Turkey, the reconversion of Hagia Sophia to a mosque is the assertion of a particular kind of Turkish ethnic nationalism, more than it is a particular kind of Islam. And to make my evidence simple for that, the first part of that is because the assertion of Turkish ethnic nationalism, the turning point, the major feature of that discourse is Turkish ethnicity, not Islam, because many of the minority groups that have been repressed by Turkish nationalism historically include other Muslims, most notably the Kurds, who in terms of their Muslim faith are denominationally, if you will, identical to Turkish Muslims. They're both Sunni. Their traditions are linguistically different, but in every other respect, the same, like say Russian or Greek Orthodox. So what are we talking about with Hagia Sophia? We're talking about, and so when you read this sermon, you read Turkish government discourse on this move, and popular discourse as well, cultural discourse, commentary in Turkish media. There's very little direct mention of the Greeks, the Byzantines, the Christians even. There is direct mention of Turkish secular nationalism. In other words, when the Turkish government thinks about what kind of conquest imagery it's using, that imagery is targeted as a critique of Turkish secular nationalism. In that sermon, the only groups that are actually targeted directly are the Kemalists, are secular Turkish nationalists. The fact that Hagia Sophia used to be Greek or Christian is actually not central to this narrative, this Turkish government narrative. What's central to the narrative is Turkish nationalism now is socially conservative and religious, whereas before it was secular and it was broadly French positivist. So that's the sort of general perspective I'm offering here, is this activity calls to mind and is experienced by Christian minorities as an act of violence against them, which indeed that's what it is. But in the Turkish discursive political context, we're talking about the assertion of a Turkish ethnic nationalism that views as equally problematic minority populations who are both Muslim and Christian. In this case, Kurdish descent and Kurdish dissenting politics, Armenian Christians, Greek Orthodox Christians, Armenian Orthodox Christians, Syriac Orthodox, etc. So those are the 2 points that I want to bring here again, is to sort of focus, at least offer my framing of this, which is the framing of, we're talking about not properly a struggle between Islam and Christianity, or even Muslims and Christians per se. So what are we talking about? We're talking about a certain kind of politics. What kind of politics are we talking about? We're talking about Turkish nationalism reshaping itself and conquering an old form of Turkish nationalism, the secularist positivist kind, and replacing it with a religious ethnic nationalism. And what unites these two is the focus on Turkish ethnicity. Islam is crucial to this ideology, but actually it's not, in my view, the most essential part of it. The most essential part of it is Turkish nationhood. And that's what I have to bring here. So thank you again for listening to my comments.
Thank you so much for your very eloquent presentation. We really appreciate your participation, and we'll have some questions for you as well at the end, as well as with the rest of the group. But for now, we're going to move on to our next panelist. Thank you again. Next up, we have another distinguished panel member, Inga Leonova. Inga is the editor-in-chief for the Wheel Journal, and is a practicing architect, writer, and educator. She taught a course on monotheism, culture, and sacred space at the Boston Architectural College and serves as the thesis advisor for the New England School of Art and Design. She is the author of several publications on orthodoxy and cultural issues, including liturgical, architecture, and ecology. And we're very excited to have her join us today. So Inga, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me to this panel, and thank you for offering me an opportunity to talk about something that I have been actually thinking and writing about for a long time. So as Cairo said, I taught for a number of years a course on semiotics of sacred space in monotheistic faiths, and I taught this course to architecture students. And we spent a significant amount of time talking about the various meanings that buildings and sacred spaces express, including buildings as political statements. So this is something that I want to talk about today very briefly, and I would like to, because I'm an architect and I think in images, I would like to present a rather eclectic collection of sacred buildings throughout history and talk about their transformation in the historical context. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So the thing that is very, I think, important to all of us that we don't think about much is that everything in material culture expresses some meaning, and the more important the object of material culture is, the more meaning it carries. As Michael Carrington suggests in his book on sacred space, quoting Heidegger, place exists and place gives meaning to things for people. So what I want to talk about is how the important buildings in various cultures carry the significance as political objects for people who are using them. And I would like to bookend my presentation with the two buildings that are preeminent for the Greek culture, since we're talking in the context not only of Hagia Sophia, but with this presentation is hosted by the Hellenic Museum, and start with the Parthenon. The Parthenon, Acropolis, as anyone who has ever visited Athens knows, is a site that dominates Athens and has dominated Athens since the most ancient times. And the main temple of the Acropolis complex was the Parthenon, temple dedicated to goddess Athena, Athena Parthenos, the virgin goddess. This is the image of Parthenon as it was in the time of antiquity, and a restoration of the interior of the Parthenon with the great statue of Athena. Now, when Christians became a dominant faith of the Eastern and Western Roman Empire, Christian Greeks took over the Parthenon. And what I think is quite interesting, and that sort of begins my story and my point, is that every time essentially a new power comes into its own, it starts by taking over the most significant space of its predecessor. So instead of building a different kind of temple for Christian use, Christians took over the Parthenon and turned it into a church dedicated to Virgin Mary, to the Theotokos. For many centuries, it was an Orthodox church, as you can see in the fragment of an icon at the top right. when the Latins, the Western Christians moved into Greece, they took over the building and also made it their primary church in Athens. It was I believe it was a Franciscan church. And then again, after the Ottoman conquest in the 15th century, it became a mosque again. It pretty much took over the same building, just built a minaret over it, and it became a mosque in 1458 and remained a mosque until the riots and destruction and the subsequent near complete destruction of the building after the explosion of the powder house, after which Parthenon never recovered. Another building that has a significant meaning in history is the Basilica of Constantine in Trier. Trier was the center of the Western Roman Empire and the seat of the Roman Emperor in the West. And this was the building of the Roman Senate in Trier. And when Constantine decided to make Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire, again, instead of building a new temple, he took the most significant building that existed in his primary city and turned it into a church by essentially stripping it of the trappings of the Senate and erecting a cross and an altar there, and it remained a church throughout Christian history. Another building from the Western Roman Empire, the Pantheon in Rome. Pantheon is the first century temple to Roman gods, to the pantheon of Roman gods. It was built in the 1st century by Emperor Agrippa. It was badly damaged in an earthquake and rebuilt in great splendor in the 2nd century by Emperor Hadrian. Again, at the time of the Roman emperors, it was the not only one of the great architectural wonders of the ancient world, but also the main temple of Rome. And at the top, you see the reconstruction of the Pantheon at the Roman times. In the apse, there was a statue of Jupiter, and in all the niches were statues of the other Roman gods. And again, when Rome became Christian, before the construction of the basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul, the great martyrs of Rome, Christians took over Pantheon and turned it into a church, dedicated it again to Virgin Mary and all Christian martyrs. So from Pantheon, it became Pan-Martyr, essentially. The great altar of Jupiter became the altar of the new church, and the statues were replaced by Christian imagery. As you can see, sometimes to a slightly comic effect, because some of the older Roman statues were simply repurposed for Christian use, as this image on the right, which was clearly a statue of a Roman emperor and his young lover, and by adding a couple of Christian symbols to it, it was turned into a statue of Saint Joseph, the betrothed and young Christ. Jumping over several countries, the most sacred space of the great city of Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, the place of the first temple of Solomon, and then the second temple built by Herod, which was destroyed by the Romans at the end of the 1st century. but again, the most sacred site of Judaism at the conquest of Jerusalem by Muslims. This was the site that was taken over as the primary Muslim site of Jerusalem, and the Dome of the Rock was built at the very place of the keystone of Solomon's temple, the great rock, which according to the Jewish and Christian and Islamic faith, is a rock on which Abraham was meant to sacrifice Isaac, where the angel stayed his hand. Also, this is the rock sacred to Muslims, because in Islam, this is the rock from which Prophet Muhammad jumped into heaven, and the trace of the hoof of his horse, of his great winged steed, is preserved in the rock. So again, the space that was sacred for the previous power in Jerusalem is taken by the new conquering power and turned into the central worshiping place for that new power to sort of stake their claim on the city. 14, 15 centuries later, Moscow, at the end of the 20th century, after the fall of communism, one of the first things that happened in the city of Moscow was the great cathedral of Christ the Savior gets rebuilt. This is the cathedral that was built at the end of the 19th century, second half of the 19th century. It was originally dedicated to the victory of the Russian army over Napoleon, but over the course of its construction, it became the largest cathedral of the Russian Empire, and the one that was dedicated to the Russian arms, to the power of the Russian army. It is essentially a military cathedral. It was razed to the ground by the communists in the 1920s. The great Olympic pool was built in its place, and it was practically one of the first actions of the new Russian government was to rebuild this cathedral, which has neither architectural nor artistic merit, but which is highly symbolic, was highly symbolic for the Russian Orthodox Church and for the Russian people, as the statement of the return of Russia to its Orthodox roots and the overthrow of the communist power. Now, that brings me in this large arc to Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia, as we all know, was constructed in the 6th century by Emperor Justinian as the essentially great monument to himself. It was built on the site of the earlier church that was built by Emperor Constantine. The site that, as you can see from the 15th century drawing, dominates the landscape of Constantinople and is sitting on the banks of the sea. Constantine built the church dedicated to Virgin Mary, and Justinian took the site over and constructed this splendid building after the Nika riots that essentially threatened to overthrow him and his power. He built this as the greatest church of the Christendom contemporary to him. And not only was it the greatest church of the East, it was also the largest and most splendid church of the entire empire. Now, by the 6th century, the tensions between the eastern and western parts of the Roman Empire have already been in full swing. So not only is this the greatest building for, as I said, the new Rome, Constantinople, it's also sort of a stick in the eye of the waning western, of the original Rome, of the waning Roman power, which is something that the fact that it was a purposeful statement, we know that from the evidence of one of the courtiers of Justinian who wrote at the time of the dedication of Hagia Sophia, "I say, renowned Roman capital, give way. My emperor has so far overstepped that wonder as a great god is superior to an idol." So if we look at Hagia Sophia, again, as the most important building of the Christian world for 9 centuries, for essentially a millennia, then it's no wonder that the warring and conquering Ottomans, when they finally overtook and completely plundered Constantinople, turned that building into their main mosque. It didn't happen right away. It remained the seat of the patriarch for a year, but in 1453, Mehmed II exiled the patriarch, destroyed the palace, and dedicated Hagia Sophia as a mosque. So again, this was, I believe, a statement that the power of Islam and the Islamic Empire is here to stay. So what I would like us to think about in the current predicament of Hagia Sophia is 2 things. First of all, of course, the act of Erdogan is wholly political, and as Dr. Dorroll presented, it is the statement of the power of the Turkish nationalist state. And it can only be viewed as such. It is not by any means a religious act. Istanbul has plenty of mosques. But what I would also like to think about, to ponder, and I don't have an answer to that, is what is it in our Orthodox reaction what is sort of our end game in protesting this act? What does Hagia Sophia mean to the world Orthodox and not only to the Greeks today? And what would we like to see happen now that this violence has been done? I believe that the Greeks still see it as a symbol of the empire long gone, just like the Russian Orthodox saw Christ the Savior as the symbol of the destroyed empire. And is the ultimate idea to reconquer Constantinople, to make it once again the main city of the Christian world? And is that the meaning that Hagia Sophia has for us? This is something that I think warrants further discussion. And thank you.
Thank you so much for that abundance of information and history about all of these different sacred spaces. It was very informative, and I'm very appreciative of all that you have brought. Which brings us to our next panelist, and our last panelist for today, Deacon David John Williams. Deacon David John is a postgraduate researcher in the Department of History at Royal Holloway University of London, where he is exploring shared sacred spaces in the Byzantine Mediterranean. Since 2016, he has taught as assistant professor of history at the University of St. Catherine in San Diego, California. He has served the Serbian Orthodox Diocese of Western America as a deacon since 2014. A Byzantinist, I'm sorry, did I say that right? I'm terribly sorry. A Byzantinist. Sorry?
Don't ask me, because I say it a ton of different ways as well.
Well, spectacular. Thank you very much for the help, though. I appreciate it. By training, Deacon David John is especially interested in the reconstruction of the sacred in various religious traditions of the Mediterranean. And without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Wow, I'm so impressed by the two presentations, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be here. I really cherish the opportunity to be here to listen. But what I suppose I'm bringing to this is, as I come from a background in examining shared sacred spaces, not just looking at spaces from a sort of chronological perspective, they belong to one faith and they belong to another, etc. I'm really interested in the use of a particular space by separate religious traditions at the same time, but also the way in which various religious traditions create sacred space through narrative, through memory, hagiography, and things like that. And there's a really strong tradition of that centered around Hagia Sophia. And I think that although I agree that this action by Erdogan is political, of course, that there is nevertheless a whole literary tradition that he wouldn't be a very good dictator if he didn't draw upon this rich tradition, right? This is something that is just a real gift to anyone that wants to rule in that particular kind of way. So I'll just go ahead and start. The use of memory to construct sacred space is particularly necessary when a culture finds itself in a new context through conquest, as the Arabs and the Ottomans did. They're presented with pre-existing sacred spaces and have to create a meaning through that architecture, that inherited architecture. Brodel laid that out explicitly when he said that Islam is a successor civilization in terms of religion, its scriptural tradition, but also in its institutional and broader cultural forms. I'm going to very briefly just talk about the incorporation of relics, relic veneration in Islam as well. But Islam has always defined itself as the final and complete revelation. And that's something that sets it apart from the other Mediterranean religions, its predecessors then. And I'd say it's fair to say that part of the conversion of pre-existing sacra has historically been to incorporate each space, object or person, into the history of Islam. A history which many of us anachronistically begin, right, with the life of the Prophet. But if we look at certain buildings like the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, we hear about the finding of various objects or foundation stones being left by prophets from many hundreds of years before the birth of Muhammad. So the case of the Kaaba is probably the first and probably best known example, right, of the appropriation of a sacred space, followed by the Temple Mount, which we've just heard about, Damascus as well, but then Constantinople, which is the reason that we're here. The case of the Hagia Sophia is the latest among these examples, and it differs slightly in that the Muslim presence in Constantinople didn't begin in 1453. There was a sizable Muslim community in Constantinople from, at the very latest, the end of the 8th century. Several mosques are recorded in Byzantine documents, as well as the various other Islamic documents from all over the Mediterranean. But the Hagia Sophia is particularly important because we have a tradition that goes all the way back to the sayings of the prophet. There's actually a very strong link there with the prophet himself. Now, a lot of these stories, myths, folk tales, whatever you want to call them, became extremely important after the city was captured. And so I would say that we should look at them as a way in which sacred space or a hierophany can be created through memory and through historiography. We should think about Hagia Sophia, the building, as like a palimpsest with multiple narratives, some of them contradictory, but all of them very important. I'm referring to the very first Islamic foundation myth, really, of Hagia Sophia, which involves the immortal, eternal, saint-like figure, Al-Qidr, who is supposed to have appeared to Justinian and given him the specifications for the building and intervened a number of times, excuse me, in its construction, and also to have named it. Now, that interpretation is based upon the Patria and a couple of other Byzantine foundation narratives and stories about Constantinople, the city specifically. The Byzantine foundation myth of Hagia Sophia is that it's an angel that appears to Justinian and gives him advice or whatever. But the character of the angel in these the Turkish folk tales, etc., is replaced by the important character of Al-Qidr. And so we have, in a way, this unusual situation where Hagia Sophia is founded actually as a mosque from the very beginning. And so anytime that we talk about its conversion to a mosque, really, according to this narrative, we're seeing it returned to its original purpose. Now, the founding of the Hagia Sophia happens, of course, and it's finished before the birth of Muhammad. But there is also another legend that says that when Muhammad was born, a whole load of very important pieces of architecture collapse around the world, right? Because of this monumental, this very important birth, advent in human history. The Arch of Khosrow is destroyed in Iran, and the Dome of Constantinople falls, right? And so the Al-Qidr appears again and intervenes. He says, in order for this dome to go back up, you need to do three things. You need to go to Mecca, where you will Medina, where you will find this boy, collect a bowl of saliva from him, collect earth from the holy ground at Mecca, and water from the miraculous spring of Zamzam, and mix this into a mortar, and that will be the only thing that's strong enough for you to keep the dome in place. And so, according to the legend, this is done. And from that point on, we have a physical embodiment, a relic, the presence of the prophet himself in the building. And I think that that's something that's, very important. The other thing is that as a lot of these legends and narratives are gaining a lot more traction, we also have a process of rediscovering of relics and special Islamic sacred spaces in Constantinople itself, sort of in the same way as the findings of various relics in Jerusalem with Constantine and Helen. One of the very important ones is the finding of the tomb of Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, who was a companion of the Prophet and died at one of the early Arab sieges of Constantinople in 674. So that discovery should be taken as a part of the construction of sacred space through memory. It's actually, it was discovered by the same, one of the main historians at the court that put together a lot of these other narratives too. Actually, by name Shemseddin, who is also the person who said the first Friday prayers there at the Hagia Sophia. And it's important to note that that was done with the sword in hand, right, which we have all seen this past week, and that caused a lot of consternation, the bearing of a sword there. But it's something that we should have expected, because the sword was always used there, because it was linked to the idea of conquest, and that the conquest was incomplete, right, because the Sultan was described as the world emperor, and the next step was Rome. That was one of the principal goals, was to reunite in some way Rome and Constantinople, with some kind of clear imperial dynastic succession, rather than an abrupt closure of the Roman period, its dismantling and its being replaced by Islam. Rather, what these narratives tell us is that there was a concerted effort to tie these things in together, which is why, Mehmed was, called Alexander, and all of these other sort of familiar figures that we would expect Byzantine emperors to be referred to as well. So there are a couple of ways that sacred space can be constructed. I think that memory is really, really important. The use, for example, of Byzantine hagiography, just the wholesale incorporation into some parts of at least the foundation myths of certain sacred spaces in the Islamic world. I think again back to Damascus, where you have there are 4 findings of the head of St. John the Baptist, and we have basically a reconstruction of all 4 of these. And instead of an emperor or a pious monk finding the head, we have actually the Caliph Al-Walid finding the head, right? So it's a symbol of piety as well, but a very interesting way to create sacred space without smashing something or having to come up with a separate miracle, right? You just reinterpret the past. I think that that's all I want to say, because I'm very interested to talk to both of you.
Thank you so much. Again, as with all of you, I greatly appreciate everything that you're all bringing to this panel. Our next couple steps, we're going to just take a couple, probably 10 or so minutes now, just for some questions. The idea of the way this is going to work is I have about 2 questions prepared for each of you, and I will give you the floor first to respond to the question that was kind of designed based on your talk. But also, if anyone else on the panel after that has anything they would like to add to that particular discussion, please feel free to just jump in. But I will give the floor first to the speaker who the question is engaging with their talk directly with first. I could have articulated that better, but that's all right. So I'm going to go just sequentially. So Phil, you briefly touched on some of the inter-Turkish conflict of identity, and I was wondering if you could perhaps comment a little further on the situation of the Kurds in modern Turkey and how that relates to the Christian minorities in the country.
Thank you. So yeah, the Kurdish minority is the largest non-ethnic Turkish minority, I believe. I'm almost positive of that, in the modern Turkish Republic. They were considered particularly problematic by the early Turkish nationalist state, the Kemalist state under Ataturk, precisely because they shared the religion of the Turkish ethnic majority. but not the linguistic tradition of that majority. And so the fact that they were actually considered themselves a separate linguistic ethnic tradition was actually formally denied by the early Turkish Republic, who famously referred to the Kurds as the Mountain Turks, as opposed to a separate group of people. And so to the extent that for the majority of the secularist interpretation of Turkish nationalism up until the past decade or so, a few decades, it was illegal to assert Kurdish ethnic identity at all, including speaking to Kurdish in public or even using parts of the Kurdish alphabet in certain contexts were criminal offenses. So that's an example of what I mean when I say that Turkish nationalism has a strong Islamic component for sure, but the Turkish element of it is more operative than the Islamic component, because a large Islamic community, Muslim community in the Turkish territory, the Kurds, have never fit comfortably in that narrative, despite the fact that they are Sunni Muslim as well. In terms of contact with the Christian populations of Anatolia, as we all know, Anatolia was populated by all different kinds of people: Turks, Kurds, Armenians, Syriac Christians, Greeks, etc. The way those communities interacted together is very complex, and I'm not an expert on that particularly, but the thing I can say in general is, during the Ottoman period, from what I understand and from my understanding, it was a very locally specific issue. It depended on local governors, local authority structures from Erzurum to Diyarbakir or wherever we're talking about. So in general, I'm not an expert on the specific dynamics among those groups, but that's sort of what I can say.
Great, thank you. And additionally, a little bit of a pivot. In light of what you've said about the origins of the conflict and so on, do you have any suggestions as to concrete ways people can encourage greater religious? I know it's a weighty question that is very complex, I'm sure, but ways people can encourage greater religious freedom in Turkey, or what sort of actions would you see as counterproductive to that effort? I know I just threw a big
policy.
one.
No, yeah.
Take a second.
Islamic studies, we like to talk about policy. We don't like to talk about policy. I think in general, what's important for me is to remain mindful of consistency in human rights discourse, I guess I can say. So if we're talking about the importance of human rights among an ethnic group, a religious group, to think about what implications those values have both within the country we're talking about and beyond. So I guess all I'm saying is that in terms of the way we talk about this, my contribution is we are talking about a violation of human rights. And so the way we talk about this issue, to me, is sort of it should be framed within that framework, rather than in other words, talking about it as a problem between, I'll just lay it on the table. Talking about it as a problem between Christians and Muslims specifically, to me, is counterproductive, because it misidentifies we're here to sort of talk about the problem, and the actual problem is not Christianity or Islam per se. It's a certain kind of human rights issue engendered by a certain kind of nationalist politics. And so that's my contribution, is just to say that to notice the way that Christianity and Islam, in this case Islam, is ideologically important, but in terms of talking about the fundamental essence of the conflict, we're talking about human rights.
Thank you very much. That was very well articulated. I appreciate it very much. Also, again, just so everyone remembers, if anyone has any other thoughts they would like to add at this juncture, feel free. If not, we can move along. Anyone have? Great. Thank you very much. I greatly, and we'll have a closing question that I would like everyone to comment on at the end.
I actually have a quick sort of thought on that. We use the hand raise feature. I probably should have done that.
I think there's few enough of us that you can just go ahead.
No, so I actually think that's one of the reasons I think it's important, what Phil just said, and I think that's one of the reasons it's important to make those connections with other instances of human rights violations, of religious freedom violations. For example, the Lakota in the Black Hills, which I know when I bring it up to people sounds like this outlandish sort of comparison, but I think it's a relevant comparison. I think it forces, particularly because Christianity, a Christian population is the sort of aggrieved party in this instance. I think maybe it forces, particularly Western audiences, to sort of reframe and rethink their sort of paradigm, and sort of helps create that more consistent application. So I appreciate those comments on consistency, is what I would say.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. I have two questions that particularly for Inga. The first being, it's common now to see Ataturk's decision to turn the Hagia Sophia into a museum as a neutralizing act. And many are advocating for it as the status quo to which we should seek to return to. Do you agree with this view, or how do you understand the secularization of sacred spaces?
This is an excellent question, and thank you for asking it. So first of all, I have expressed certainly on social media, so I'm happy that you've given me the opportunity to say to a larger audience my great discomfort with the lionization of Ataturk that is happening in the wake of this drama with Hagia Sophia. The idea that somehow Ataturk was this enlightened ruler who has engendered inter-religious harmony by creating a museum out of Hagia Sophia is completely negating denying the history of Ataturk, who was a murderous and genocidal tyrant. You know, the genocide of the Armenians and the burning of Smyrna are all in his wake. And in a way, I see really nothing positive in the secularization of Hagia Sophia, because in fact, I see it from the Ataturk's perspective as an offense to all religious parties in Turkey, Christians and Muslims. I mean, it was, however we Orthodox may feel about it, it was a house of prayer for many, many centuries. It was always a house of prayer, and so what Ataturk did was strip it of that purpose. So I see really no cause for celebration. Now, the other part of this question is what could be the best solution at the present time. And this, I think, is a less straightforward answer, because you know, I think that even the idealists among us realize the practical sides of, you know, even some miracle happened, and under the pressure, sustained pressure of the international community, Hagia Sophia was gifted to the Patriarchate of Constantinople. We don't have people to, we have neither means nor physical ability to maintain a building of such magnitude or historical significance. I would also say a probably unpopular thing, but I will say it nevertheless, that after 1500 years, this is a sacred space, is the building that is that belongs both to Christian and Islamic faiths. So I don't think there is a straightforward solution. So under such circumstances, probably neutrality would be a better path. But again, no credit to Ataturk.
You actually kind of touched on a little bit my follow-up question to you, which is, what are your thoughts on sharing a sacred spaces between religious communities, particularly in such a historically charged space like the Hagia Sophia, which you kind of did just touch on a little bit. If you would like to expand a little bit more, you're welcome to. Or
I actually would. I have done I've done a lot of study on ecumenical use of the space. I actually did my master's thesis on the subject, and I have designed two, I think, interdenominational chapels. And what I can say about it is that it is certainly a solution, a use that has precedent in the modern world. This use comes about for different reasons. There's an interesting example in Soviet Estonia with the Calvinist church, which opened its doors to all the homeless communities in the city. So it worked as a homeless faith communities. So all the Christian communities that didn't have an official home in the Soviet Union, plus the local Jewish community and the local Muslim community, prayed in that building, and that went on for a very long time. And of course, we're all familiar with non-denominational chapels at the universities and hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. I think that, again, as an idealist, I would love to see that go on in Hagia Sophia. I think that it actually might be, strangely enough, the best solution for the Christian community in Turkey. I also think that it would respect the shared legacy, but of course this is the point of view that garners your enemies from all sides.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your perspective on that. I know it's quite a large question that clearly no one has found the answer to, or we would not still be discussing it. So I appreciate you sharing your thoughts. I know that Phil has to duck out shortly, so if it's all right with everyone, I want to jump to the general question I'd love to field to all of you, and then circle back to Deacon David, if that's all right with everyone. I just want to make sure that he's able to comment on this last little portion that we have. So I don't know if everyone in the audience of this video has seen this yet, but on the heels of this morning's announcement from Syrian President al-Assad, I'm curious to know what you all think of the attempt to recreate sacred space on their announcement that they are going to, with Russia's assistance, rebuild the Hagia Sophia. Yeah. So I'm curious. Yeah, I'm curious to know what you all think about this. Is it possible, in your view, to recreate a space like this? Or additionally, if you would like to comment on the political realities of such a move, also feel free to do so. So this is a question that I would love to hear all of your thoughts on, if you have something you would like to share in any order that feels appropriate. So if anyone has any initial thoughts they would like to jump in with, feel free.
Well, if I can start, because I did see the news, and also because I'm Russian, and a Russian with no love for the Russian imperial ambitions. I think that this offer by the gang of Putin and Assad is a perfect demonstration of that this is not by any means, any stretch of imagination, a religious conflict. This is entirely a political conflict. And it is, I think, not that I'm a great fan of conspiracy theories, but is giving some credence to the idea that Russian support was very much behind this act, hostile act by Erdogan, because it now gave Putin this really horrendous, ridiculous opening to further stake his claim, stake Russia's claim as the ruling power in the Middle East. And so, of course, the co-opting of the sacred building, the idea of a sacred building for those purposes is quite disgusting, but everyone from Constantine himself has done that, so this is nothing new. I think that, and I would say that I think that it's just probably in some ways, to me, more of a scandal than even what happened in Istanbul.
Thank you for your perspective. I greatly appreciate you sharing. Does anybody else have a thought that they're ready to jump in with?
I do.
Go ahead, Katie.
Yeah, so I do a lot of writing about and work on the question of sort of Orthodoxy and Russian soft power, and the ways that Russia has tried to position itself, from very early on, really from the time of the fall of Constantinople, as the third Rome, as the rightful inheritor of the Orthodox Christian tradition, of sort of real Christianity, of the Roman Empire. And I think Inga's probably right. Like, once again, I don't want to delve into conspiracy theories, but some things look very convenient. And this is certainly an instance that's very convenient for Putin. And I would hope that Orthodox Christians, speaking as a whole, can recognize the extent to which we're being played a little bit here, I think, by people who don't necessarily have sort of the best of intentions. And I also think for Greek people, with respect to our audience, for ethnic Greeks, for members of the Greek diaspora, for Greek citizens, I think it's important to listen to the ways that this move, particularly with the support of Russia, tries to de-ethnicize the events in Constantinople, and to make this a clash of religious identity, and not what I would argue, at the core of the Turkish Greek conflict, which is an ethnic, essentially an ethnic clash, but also the ways in which Russia then is trying to wrestle away Orthodox antiquity from the Greeks.
Thank you very much, Katie. And then if Phil or Deacon David have any thoughts as well, feel free at this juncture.
I suppose the only brief thing I would say, I actually didn't see this, so I defer to everyone else who's aware of this. I guess the first thing that pops into mind is, when we're talking about political context, the Syrian political context is so radically different from the Turkish one. The Syrian state, the Ba'athist state that's been in existence since the early 1970s under Hafiz al-Assad, and now Bashar al-Assad, is a genuinely totalitarian society. So my point is, what the Syrian government says it is or is going to do is a whole different set of analytical strictures than what other governments do. So just when I think about the Syrian context, I think about however we think about this, that we're talking, especially the way it talks about Christianity, is just a very, very distinctive discourse that has a lot to do with really totalitarian politics and the extraordinary violence inflicted by the Syrian state on its civilians.
Thank you for that context. I think it's very important, so I appreciate you adding it. And then Deacon David, if you have any thoughts you would like to tack on.
I would just say that I find it incredibly insulting that these kind of statements and plans can be laid, and the response that we are supposed to have is one of credulity. It's good imperial practice for two human toothbrushes like Putin and al-Assad, but it's pretty cheap, it's pretty cheap. But obviously, we're talking about politics as the primary motivator here. I agree. But we are all being taken advantage, those of us that are Orthodox, regardless of where we are, we're being taken advantage of here. It's a cheap way of getting Christian support for a totalitarian regime.
Right.
More. And, it cashes in on some of the, some of these sayings, prophecies of modern elders that talk about Russia coming in at a time like this, for example, and restoring Hagia Sophia, Constantinople, etc. It's a cheap thing, but what can we expect? And this is nothing that's unique to that region of the world. I don't really see that much of a difference between this and Trump waving a Bible in front of the church. So,
I think that's
a little more blood.
Well, yes, yeah. The methodology is sound, proven imperial policy. I think.
Yeah. That has a lot of history in many, many different places. Thank you all for your very thoughtful commentary on this new development as of this morning that I was not aware of either until Katie sent me an article this morning about it and said we should probably talk about this today. So, and then Phil, I know that you might have to jump off, so whenever you need to jump off, feel free.
Well, we have to thank the good Deacon for sharing the article about the Syrian Hagia Sophia, which is how I found out.
So thank you for bringing that up. I think it's a really important thing to address. So I'm grateful that you brought that to Katie's attention, and then by way of Katie, my attention as well. I think
if I can just add a little bit of interesting data to that, to actually responding to Phil's point. The way that this is presented in Russian media is that the statement was made by President Putin, who said that with their benevolence and assistance of his dear friend, Bashar Assad, Russia would be presents this offer of rebuilding Hagia Sophia on friendly territory. So it's presented again as a Russian initiative. And again, if anybody knows the history of Russian Empire that Katie alluded to, they have been making inroads into Constantinople since time immemorial and never stopped. Nothing, Middle East is that place where every story goes several millennia back. Just the repetition of the same story.
Thank you for the additional insight. It's greatly appreciated. And so I have to circle back again. I know I jumped the order that I myself set up, but to jump back a little bit to Deacon David and your lovely presentation today. I'm struck by the idea that we don't know each other's historical narratives. We cohabitate and are in conversation with each other so often, but then often don't actually know the history or where each other is coming from necessarily. Perhaps putting on your clerical hat for a moment, do you have any ideas or thoughts about how this kind of lack of communication understanding might be rectified? I know, again, as many things that I've brought forward today, that's a very large question that I'm sure has a lot of various opinions, but.
Yeah, well, I think that, there's a lot of tribalism. The way that we're taught to view God is in a very sort of reductive, tribal way. Our God is different to yours, etc. That's problematic. I think education, but dialogue is important. These are obviously incredibly painful things sometimes. But we have the freedom living where we do, in Western Europe or the North America, to have some of these conversations that are a little bit less kind of fraught with pain and very recent memory. But going forward, as Inga said, I think that probably the best thing would be to try and accommodate and accept these competing narratives regarding the space. How you do that is incredibly difficult, and it's a lot easier to overcome that kind of thing in a place like a university chapel or an airport chapel, where the space is really blank and there's no ontological change in that space. You project the meaning while you're there, and then you put your items in the assigned box and they go away and they're out of view, and then the next person comes in and it becomes an entirely different space. That the problem with Hagia Sophia and many other places like that is that they are they're believed to be ontologically different. There is a change that's happened there that can't be reversed. And when we talk about secularization of space as well, this is something that is very important. Can a space ever become secularized? It's a difficult thing to answer. It also depends on where your starting point is. is everything sacred? If the sacred is the starting point and we make things out of it, we make the secular even out of the sacred. The older way of thinking about it has been that we live in profane space and then we make special sacred space. But that is entirely a point of view. So.
As with many things, it's a fraught and difficult thing to kind of come to a general conclusion about. But I appreciate all of your patience with me when I ask these very broad and difficult questions, and you're all responding with much thoughtfulness and grace. So I appreciate that from all of you. And the last question that I had prepared is that you mentioned the presence of Muslims in the city of Constantinople from the 8th century. Could you briefly talk about what their experiences might have looked like, what it might have been like, how much religious freedom were they allowed, and so on?
Yeah, sure. Well, the earliest source is from Constantine Porphyrogenitus, but there isn't much, as you would expect, detail given about, certainly not the inner life of these people, but we do have at various times, as you would expect, a little bit of anxiety having the presence of a religious other in a city, especially in times of stress. And those are the times where we get the complaints from various patriarchs about the call to prayer being too loud or whatever. But the various Muslim communities that were there seem to have been allowed to have been enrolled in the various guilds that were very important, the trading system they were very instrumental in. There were also, we can't forget that there was a Jewish community there in Constantinople from pretty much the very beginning, and they actually had some stricter. They encountered more problems in terms of being able to build synagogues or expand them or whatever. And of course, in canon law, they are singled out in a way that Muslims aren't actually, because Islam was viewed for a very long time as simply a Christian heresy rather than a different religion. And so that space is negotiated in a different way. I mean, space is literally negotiated in Eastern canon law, as in you can't be in the same area as a Jew, for example. I'm thinking about bathhouse, but also there are lots of examples. The emperors took pride in being patrons of the mosques, donating, splendid things, as you would expect. And during the Fourth Crusade, Nikitas Choniatis talks about the Latin Crusaders attacking one of the mosques and trying to loot it, and the Christian Byzantines protected the mosque and the people around and helped them. That's not to say that there's an overwhelming Constantinopolitan camaraderie, because at various points in history there was tension there, but it's more to do with external factors. Some of the things that caused strife were, the commemoration of a particular caliph rather than his rival. The sources aren't great, and some people have fought pretty hard against the idea of the Byzantines even allowing mosques in their city. But I think it's an untenable position now with so much evidence and so many sources.
You've touched on the issue which I've also thought about and discussed a lot, and that really has to come into play in somehow in all its conversations, and that is that we are dealing with very different narratives between the faith traditions, in that Islam views itself, as you said at the beginning of your presentation, as the all-encompassing.
Yes.
religion as the fulfillment of the religions, but Islam does not view either Judaism or Christianity as the wrong faith, right? The Western idea of infidels is, understanding of the concept of infidels has nothing to do with how it actually is understood in Islam proper. Hence the whole, narrative of people of the book and the incorporation of the, not only of the stories, but of hagiography, of the slight deviations of hagiography. And so that is something that is, that really has to come into play in any theological conversations and negotiations about the space. For example, this whole hysteria about the destruction of the sacred imagery in Hagia Sophia takes no notion of the fact that most of the old imagery of Hagia Sophia has been destroyed by the iconoclasts. And what we have is what's been preserved by the Muslims throughout the next 500 years of history. And so I think that this is really something that deserves serious a serious conversation, and I think it's the scholars like you who owe the Orthodox narrative this explanation.
Well, I think that what is really missing, and what I should probably have said in answer to Cara's question, is that how do we get around this? We need to be realistic and look at our own history and realize that we didn't form in a vacuum. All of us, all of the traditions have influenced each other. Just because the Christian church was around for longer, but before the coming of Islam, and there are so many things which developed in tandem and entirely influenced by each other. We've been in contact with each other for a lot longer than we were separate, and it's not all said and done. We
owe so much of our theology to the golden age of the caliphs that allowed us the discourse, right?
Yeah, certainly. But people are horrified because people are so concerned today about ritual purity, I think that's where this move probably comes from as well. I mean, by the way, I don't doubt that. I wouldn't want to even set foot in the same room as him, let alone his own mind. But I don't doubt that Erdogan is sincere in his religious conviction that it's the right thing to do to restore Hagia Sophia to its status as a mosque. Now, do I think that he's doing it? Well, he has the power to do it. Is he doing it for political support? Yeah, of course. But I don't think that we can see into anyone's heart, and you know what I mean. I think it's a temptation because I view things very much from a political point of view as well, but it can become an obstacle sometimes because maybe he truly, the story is that he said that he dreamt about doing it from his childhood.
I think part of the reason, if I could just sort of jump in, I think part of the reason we tend to, I think that dichotomy is really interesting. I think part of the reason we tend to focus on the political narrative maybe has something to do with a genuine and I think a good effort to try to excuse someone's co-religionists, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
The case
like Putin with his new Hagia Sophia in Syria, right?
We want to excuse ourselves from that, and what I would say is, you're already excused, right? That if we, in both Islam and Christianity, in the Abrahamic faith broadly, individuals have individual accountability for their actions.
Yeah.
And I think it's more difficult because of the discourse surrounding this, but I think there is space to say these are born of people's genuine religious convictions. Is this the normative way that their co-religionists interpret the faith? No. Is this the way that I'm Orthodox and so is Vladimir Putin, but I would not do the things Vladimir Putin does.
Yes. Yeah.
And I would hope. I mean, who knows what I would do with.
I was going to say, Katie,
Ask Cairo how I am at our weekly meetings. But
nothing but lovely. Don't do that to yourself.
I mean, I think if we can move away from a discourse that sort of has guilt by association,
right?
I think we can start to talk about those genuinely felt religious motives that do with politics and the sort of complicated space of human hearts and minds.
And it's so difficult because, not for many reasons, but also because, you've got Cyprus occupied since 1974. How can we be expected to have a conversation about Hagia Sophia with level heads? It colors everything. Just to name one kind of small infringement of the modern secular Turkish regime,
That's one thing that I forgot to bring up when I was talking about the Dome of the Rock is that, yes, this whole practice is fraught with conflict, but Jews go and pray at the stone, at the rock, right? It's not, yes, they do go there under the protection of Israeli guns, but that was not always the case.
I mean, another example is the Church of St. George.
Yes.
Where people.
Yep.
I mean, one of the great good strokes of good luck in my life is that I was able to go to Syria when you could still go.
Yeah.
And that Church of St. George. What was amazing to me was when I went there for Divine Liturgy, and there were maybe 3 Christians in the building. There were maybe 3 Christians there. So I think, that there are these organic instances.
Well, there were, an even grander example is Christian services at the tomb of, at the Blue God in Damascus, the tomb of John the Baptist, that have been going on forever. Western, Western services and Eastern services. So it's not like this is, something that has never happened in history or is just a phenomenon of the 20th century, airport and hospital chapels. This is something that actually has home in the Middle East.
Yeah, and I would say wider, I mean, there's obviously an absolute ton of it on the Indian subcontinent. I think that this is just, we approach it like as if it's, part of multicultural, ecumenical relations, being politically correct and enlightened, but really it's not. It's just how human beings approach God, and sometimes they overlook the differences that they have with other people because they're convinced or they need a miracle. That's it. As far as I'm concerned, that's kind of it. It's just as basic as that to me. I mean, I keep getting told that I generalize too much, but I mean, for heaven's sake, I mean, we are talking about suspension in belief whenever we're talking about religion in any case. So,
I do not agree with the publication of Go Set a Watchman, because I don't think you should manipulate a person's dying moments to publish a book they didn't want published. But there's a great line in there: prejudice a dirty word and faith a clean one have one thing in common. They both begin where reason ends.
That's very helpful context. And again, I want to thank everyone for all of your thoughts and your expertise. We greatly appreciate you offering them to us today. Katie, I know that you said that you have a couple of things that you want to
No, all I want to do is thank everyone again, especially for the short notice. And this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you, Cairo, for being a lovely moderator. And usually at this point, we would give you a mug. But unfortunately, due to what my 4-year-old goddaughter calls the sickness, you do not get a mug. All of you are missing out on mugs. But one day when the sickness goes away, I will make sure that you all get National Hellenic Museum mugs. So thank you very, very much. I'm looking forward to seeing what the final product looks like.
Yes. Thank you all again for lending your expertise and your time. It was greatly appreciated, and I thoroughly enjoyed listening to all of you and your perspectives. And I know that sharing opinions, especially about things that have a lot of emotions attached to them, is a vulnerable thing to do in many ways. So I very much appreciate all of your willingness to share your perspectives with us today. So thank you.
Thank you.